You're looking to understand the big shifts, right? The important topics, but without getting totally bogged down in endless details.
We get that.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, getting you the core insights quickly and thoroughly.
And today, we're tackling a really significant piece. This recent memo from Howard Marks at Oaktree Capital Management. It's titled, "Nobody Knows," yet again.
Right. That title probably rings a bell for anyone who follows financial history. Howard Marks, he's a veteran investor, seen it all, navigated so many economic storms.
He really has.
And he's used that nobody knows title before, hasn't he? Around the 2008 crisis, I remember.
Yep, the global financial crisis, and then again right at the start of the COVID pandemic, March 2020.
So when he uses that title again, you kind of know it's a signal. Time to pay attention.
Absolutely. This time, the uncertainty he's zeroing in on, it's largely coming from these newly implemented tariffs. So our mission today, let's say, is to unpack his analysis of this whole situation. Look at the potential effects, which could be pretty widespread, and really get why he keeps emphasizing the fundamental unpredictability of things, especially when we're facing something maybe as new as this, a potential huge shift in global trade.
Okay, let's dive in. So Marx kicks off, and this is interesting, drawing a parallel between the current tariff situation and 2008. What's the core similarity he sees there?
Well, what's really fascinating is this shared feeling that the old rules don't apply anymore, that established norms have been, overturned.
Like in 2008 when major banks just collapsed, unthinkable beforehand.
Exactly. And Marx suggests these big changes in global trade, the ones driven by tariffs, they feel similarly unprecedented. He points out that the patterns we've seen for, 80 years in international commerce, they might not be a reliable guide anymore.
We just don't have a clear playbook for this kind of large-scale trade conflict in today's world.
Precisely. No real historical precedent for this scale, this interconnectedness.
It's that feeling of being in uncharted territory. And Marx keeps coming back to this central idea, like, nobody knows. It's almost like a refrain in the memo.
It really is. He hammers home the limits of, making predictions, especially when things are in such flux. He even sort of jokes that analyze the future is almost an oxymoron.
Because it hasn't happened yet.
Right, it hasn't been created.
Yeah.
And it's shaped by so many complex, unknowable variables.
So, okay, if the future is that uncertain, what's the point? What's the value in trying to figure out what's happening now?
That's a crucial point he addresses. Marx acknowledges the uncertainty, definitely, but he warns against letting it paralyze you into inaction.
Doing nothing is still a choice.
Exactly. He quotes Walter Diemer's book, "When the time comes to buy, you won't want to." It's a reminder that, big opportunities often pop up during these scary, uncertain times when everyone else is running for the hills.
So deciding not to act needs just as much scrutiny as deciding to act.
For sure. It requires real critical thought.
Okay, that's a really key nuance. Let's get into the tariffs themselves. According to Marx, what were the main goals behind them? What was President Trump trying to achieve?
Well, Marx lays out the stated goals. Things like supporting U.S. manufacturing, encouraging exports, discouraging imports.
Shrinking the trade deficit.
Right. Securing supply chains by bringing production back home, onshoring, deterring unfair trade practices, forcing negotiations, even generating some revenue.
And viewed individually, those goals sound, desirable, don't they?
On the surface, yes, absolutely. Each one seems reasonable in isolation. But Marx quickly pivots to the really critical part, the second and third order consequences, the ripple effects. And those are incredibly hard to predict.
Because it's never just A leads to B in economics, is it? There are always those knock-on effects.
Precisely. And that's where the unpredictability really kicks in. It's driven by human behavior, political factors. Marx uses this great Feynman quote about imagining if electrons had feelings to make the point.
Right. Economies are made of people, and people react in complicated, sometimes irrational ways.
Exactly. Their reactions to these tariffs won't be simple or always predictable.
So what are some of the likely negative consequences Marx sees coming down the pike?
Oh, the list is pretty long. He talks about the near certainty of retaliation from other countries, which, frankly, we're already seeing happen.
Yeah.
Then there's the high probability of price increases, rising inflation. Tariffs are basically taxes on imports, right? And those costs usually get passed on to consumers, you and me.
So things get more expensive.
Which can then lead to demand destruction, people buying less. And that could potentially trigger a recession, job losses, not just here, but abroad too.
Plus supply shortages?
Supply shortages, disruptions. And he even flags the possibility of a really massive change in the whole world order.
Wow. Okay, let's zoom in on that price impact. How exactly do tariffs make everyday stuff more expensive for people?
Think about it simply. A tariff gets slapped on an imported good. That immediately makes it more expensive for the company importing it.
Okay.
Now, maybe they absorb a tiny bit of that cost, but realistically, they're going to pass most of it on to the retailer.
And the retailer passes it on to us.
Bingo. Higher prices at the checkout.
Hmm.
And it's not just for things made entirely overseas. It also hits stuff made here if it uses imported parts or materials in the process.
Marx makes a really striking point about the prices of things like cars, appliances, electronics over the past few decades. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening. He points out that between roughly 1995 and 2020, the real prices of consumer durables in the U.S., cars, appliances, electronics, lots of which are imported, actually fell quite significantly.
So they got cheaper relative to everything else.
Exactly. And during that same time, overall inflation was pretty low, pretty tame. So Marx asked this great question. What would inflation have looked like without those low-cost imports holding prices down?
It suggests tariffs could reverse a trend that's actually been helping keep inflation in check for a long time.
It really could. A significant deflationary force we've benefited from for decades might just go poof.
Okay, what about the goal of bringing manufacturing back, reshoring jobs? Does Marx think tariffs are actually effective for that?
He points out some pretty big obstacles. First, just basic capacity. In many sectors, the U.S. just doesn't have enough factories right now to make everything that's currently imported.
Building new factories takes time.
A lot of time, yeah, often years. And it takes huge investment. Companies aren't going to make those massive bets unless they feel confident the policy environment is stable long term.
Which is hard when tariffs can change with administrations or get renegotiated like NAFTA did.
Exactly. Look at NAFTA becoming USMCA and now these new tariffs on top. It creates uncertainty. Second, there's the skills question. Do we have enough workers with the right skills ready to step into those manufacturing roles?
Maybe not everywhere.
And maybe the most fundamental point he makes. Why did we start importing so much in the first place? Often, it was simply cheaper than making things here.
Cost savings.
Right. Higher U.S. labor costs, maybe lack of product differentiation sometimes. He uses Volkswagen as an example. People bought VWs because they offered good value, not necessarily because tariffs were super low.
So even if tariffs make U.S.-made goods relatively cheaper compared to the now tariffed imports, the overall price level for consumers still likely goes up.
That's the likely outcome, yes. And Marx points out most Americans don't have huge amounts of spare cash, so higher prices probably mean a hit to their living standards.
Unless wages jump up just as fast.
Which could then ignite a really dangerous inflationary spiral. That's the worry.
He also brings up corporate profit margins. That sounds like a key indicator to watch.
Very much so. He references Conrad de Quadros' view that profit margins are often a leading indicator for recessions.
How do tariffs squeeze margins?
Well, tariffs increase cost for companies using imported goods or components. If they can't pass all that cost on, or if higher prices lead to fewer sales, their profit margins get squeezed.
And when profits shrink,
Companies tighten their belts, layoffs, cutting back investment. That can feed right into a broader economic slowdown or recession.
he mentioned the 2018 steel tariffs as a kind of case study.
Yeah, he cited some analysis suggesting that while those tariffs might have saved maybe 1,000 jobs in the steel industry itself, they potentially cost something like 75,000 jobs in industries that use steel because steel became more expensive for them.
Wow, that really highlights the trade-offs, doesn't it? Balancing help for one sector against harm to others. And what about consumers versus those who lost jobs?
Exactly. He touched on this in a 2016 memo too, the difficult balance between supporting workers displaced by globalization and the benefits consumers get from cheaper imported goods. It's a tough needle to thread.
The memo also gets into the international fallout, which sounds potentially huge.
Oh, definitely. Marx really stresses the positive impact global trade has had since World War II, not just on prosperity, but potentially on peace too.
How so?
Mostly through comparative advantage. Italy focuses on pasta, Switzerland on watches.
Yeah.
They trade. Everyone gets more efficient. Costs are lower. Standards of living rise. Tariffs mess with that whole principle. They force inefficiency.
And the U.S. has been a massive beneficiary of this global system.
Absolutely. We've enjoyed a higher quality of life, partly because of affordable imports. Think about walking to Walmart, how much stuff is imported.
A lot.
Right. And he also talks about U.S. foreign policy post-WWII, this idea of generosity toward the rest of the world stemming from enlightened self-interest.
Like the Marshall Plan. aid to Japan.
Exactly. Foreign aid, alliances, these weren't just charity. They created markets for U.S. goods, built stable trading partners, helped contain communism. It all ultimately benefited the U.S. economy and security.
So how could the current tariff policies unravel that?
Well, Marx outlined several risks. Antagonizing allies, creating trade friction. It could push countries maybe closer to rivals like China or Russia for trade and investment. It could also make other nations less willing to invest in the U.S., including buying U.S. Treasury bonds.
And that relates to the U.S. deficit, right? The golden credit card idea.
Precisely. The world's willingness to buy U.S. debt has allowed the U.S. to run large deficits relatively easily. If that appetite shrinks because of trade tensions or questions about U.S. reliability,
Interest rates could go up, making the debt situation worse.
that's the potential risk, yes. Higher borrowing costs for the U.S. government, which could compound the national debt problem.
He shares a story about Peter Navarro and worries about Japan's car industry in the 80s. What's the lesson there?
It's a great illustration of how dynamic economies are. Back then, huge panic about Japanese cars destroying the U.S. auto industry. But since then, the U.S. economy has actually grown way more than Japan's, even adjusting for population and currency.
So losing ground in one sector doesn't mean the whole economy tanks.
Not at all. Economies evolve. Countries decline in some areas, rise in others, often moving into higher value activities. The point is, trying to fight those fundamental economic shifts with protectionism often backfires. Resisting economic gravity, so to speak.
And that leads him to this pretty blunt conclusion. The tariffs are an own goal.
Yeah, that's his term. He draws a direct parallel to Brexit.
Saying it's self-inflicted damage.
Pretty much. Harm to the UK's economy, its morale, its international standing, all self-inflicted. He suggests the tariffs could similarly lead to a likely recession here, higher inflation, serious economic dislocation in the short term.
Even if maybe some long-term goals like more U.S. manufacturing eventually happen.
Right. He highlights the asymmetry.
Yeah.
The costs are likely immediate, while any potential benefits are delayed, uncertain, and might not even outweigh the costs.
What about the markets? How have they reacted, and what might the Fed do? Marx touches on that too.
He notes the stock market dropped after the tariff news broke, but admits it's really hard to say if the market's reaction was, appropriate or overdone.
Always tough to gauge in the moment.
And the Fed. They're in a tricky spot. Do they cut rates to fight a potential recession? Or keep them higher to fight the inflation caused by the tariffs?
Because tariff-driven inflation might not respond to rate hikes in the usual way.
That's the concern Marx raises. It's not necessarily driven by an overheating economy in the same way, so the Fed's usual tools might be less effective.
And for Oaktree specifically, in their investment world, what's the outlook?
He mentions that all this uncertainty has, unsurprisingly, pushed up risk premiums in the credit markets. Yield spreads have widened.
Meaning investors demand higher returns for taking on risk.
Exactly. And they also anticipate seeing more opportunities in distressed debt as companies potentially struggle under these new economic pressures.
He kind of wraps up the memo with a familiar theme for him, doesn't he? A closing thought.
He does. He echoes his 2008 memo, basically reminding readers that these periods of fear and maximum uncertainty when risk is being priced in, sometimes excessively, can actually be the times when bargains emerge.
The old babies thrown out with the bathwater idea?
Pretty much. Opportunities arise when pessimism peaks.
So pulling it all together then, what's the absolute core message we should take from Mark's deep dive into these tariffs?
I think the fundamental takeaway is just the sheer level of uncertainty we're facing. These tariffs inject a huge amount of unpredictability into the economic landscape, with potentially massive, far-reaching consequences that, frankly, nobody really knows yet.
As the title says.
Exactly. And as Howard Marks lays out so clearly, while we don't know the specific outcomes, trying to understand the potential mechanisms, the ripple effects, the historical parallels, that's crucial for navigating whatever comes next.
And thinking about that interconnectedness he highlights, it does raise a final thought, doesn't it? In this globally linked world facing such uncertain economic shifts, how might our actions, not just government policies, but maybe individual choices, community efforts, how might they shape the path forward? Amidst all this potential disruption, what role do we play? Definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.